Now the story of the cooling board. A chap by the name of Massey, who was again in his middle 90s, had brought that into a friend of mine that said it should go into to a museum. He said, my father ran the cooling board. Now in those days, in frontier days, there were no mortuaries, there were no undertakers here, and often you were just buried behind the barn in a makeshift graveyard. Each region had a man appointed as a cooling board operator, and his job was, when he got word that someone had died, he'd send someone up with his buggy and pick up the body and bring it back and put it on the cooling board. Now they called it a cooling board because the body would lay there for maybe 2 or 3 days. And at the end of the 3rd day, they reckoned that that person was really dead, because people would get influenza or pneumonia, and you couldn't get any breath, holding a mirror, etc. So they brought him back to the cooling board, and that board sat on a couple of sawhorses. And Mr. Bussey said over 500 bodies passed over that board. Now keep in mind, the average soldier fighting in the Civil War was 5 feet tall. 5 feet was a tall man. 6 feet was unheard of. And so they would be laid out on the cooling board. And Mr. Bussey told Mr. Ferguson, he said, my father loved to tell the story. The time we brought the body in, and the folks where the body was brought in sent a runner over to the house and said, listen, we're bringing folks down from North Georgia and North Alabama, and they won't be here for 5 days, so keep the body a few extra days. So the fellow said, no problem. And after 5 days, they asked for another 2-day extension. So the body had been outside laying on the cooling board for 7 days. And then they finally said, we're ready for the return of our whoever had died. And the fellow, Mr. Bussey's father, called his black helper and said, go out and wash the body and dress it. They always dressed the body. They gave him a suit or whatever they had, a finery to dress the body. So the black fellow went out, and the body had laid there for 7 days, and rigor mortis, of course, had set in. So he grabbed the arms, which were stiff, and he flipped them off that cooling board. And as he flipped them off, all the gases were in the body came out, and the body went, according to Mr. Bussey. The black fellow dropped the body and ran into the woods. It took him 3 days to find him, to bring him back, and meanwhile, they finally got the body back for the funeral. And that's the story of the cooling.